Hi, this is John Goodman. Today we are talking about what the phrase "as is" means in a contract. Now, unlike the phrase "earnest money going hard," which we talked about in the last webcast, that phrase "earnest money going hard" doesn't have any meaning. The phrase "as is" actually does have meaning, but it doesn't mean what most people think it means. Some people think that the phrase "as is" means that the seller is not obligated to disclose anything about the property, that it relieves the seller from disclosing adverse problems, latent material defects that the seller is aware of regarding the property. That is not what "as is" means. And in Colorado, for example, in residential real estate transactions, it's pretty clear that a seller cannot contract away the seller's obligations to disclose latent material defects of which they're aware of. Perhaps in commercial real estate transactions they can, but not in transactions that are primarily, not in transactions where the seller is primarily selling property that is for household use. Okay, some people think "as is" means that it takes away the buyer's inspection rights to inspect the property. No, that's not what it means. And if that's what the seller is intending, then there should be an explicit provision taking away the buyer's inspection rights under a contract. Some sellers think that it means that the seller does not have an obligation to make any repairs in response to any of the buyer's due diligence objections. No, that's not what that phrase means. And it's unnecessary because most contracts do not have provisions in them that require the seller to address buyer's due diligence objections. Some sellers think it just means that the buyer can object based on their due diligence objections. In Colorado, what we would call an inspection objection. The buyer can object, but the seller is signaling that it's not going to make any repairs. Well, the seller can signal that outside of the contract. That doesn't have to be language inside the contract. That's not what "as is" means. So, what does "as is" mean? What does "as is" mean? All "as is" means is that it's the seller is disclaiming any implied warranties about the property. The seller is not warranting the property, for example, that the property can be used for the buyer's intended purpose. It's also a phrase that means that between the buyer and the seller, the buyer bears the risk of any latent defects in the property that the seller was not aware of. That's all "as is" means. It doesn't do any good for a seller to add it to the Colorado contract because the Colorado state-approved contract has "as is" pre-printed in it. So, don't use "as is" in the contract. All right, thanks for listening. And remember, we live in a complicated world. Be careful out there.